Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Georgia Republican governor's primary between incumbent Georgia Governor Brian Kemp and former Republican Senator David Perdue. So we'll be taking a look quickly at this insider article before we get into some polling and previous election results of both candidates to determine which would be a stronger Republican nominee to go up against Stacey Abrams in the general. But before we do all that, please consider subscribing down below if you enjoy this video. Like this video down below, it really helps out the channel. Now, going straight into this article, Trump has decided to drop his endorsement of David Perdue ahead of Tuesday's governor's primary, primarily due to the fact that David Perdue has been polling pretty terribly in this race. I mean, if we take a look at the polls currently, David Perdue is down in the aggregate by about 25 percentage points. And since April, he hasn't polled above, Brian Kemp hasn't polled below 50%, which in Georgia is the threshold to avoid a runoff election, which would basically take the other lower tier candidates out of the race and just pit Brian Kemp against David Perdue in a two-way race, which in that hypothetical, Brian Kemp is still likely to win with a sizable percentage of the vote. Now, looking at these polls, even back when David Perdue decided to run in December. Now, David Perdue's electoral prospects were a little strange to begin with. He originally filed to run for Kelly Loeffler's old seat. He decided to drop that and run for governor against Kemp, with the promise that Donald Trump would endorse him, which he did back in December when David Perdue announced his run. But even during that period of time, David Perdue never polled above Brian Kemp. There was only one period, and it was by one poll back in December, where David Perdue polled 3 points above Brian Kemp. Every other poll since then, Brian Kemp has had a sizable lead, with the closest poll really being in the high single digits after that point. So David Perdue from early on really wasn't gaining a lot of traction with the Republican base, despite in 2021, many Republicans being angered with how Brian Kemp handled the 2020 election in the state of Georgia, and also his Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. So looking at this article, it's not really a surprise David Perdue was dropped by Donald Trump. Mo Brooks, one of the Senate candidates in the Alabama primary, which I'll cover before that race, which is also on Tuesday, he was also dropped by Donald Trump once his polling numbers kind of slipped. And, once David Perdue's numbers slipped, even though Trump enthusiastically supported him back in December and even did a rally or two for him, he dropped David Perdue like a bag of rocks once it became clear that he had no chance of winning the governor's primary. And I think really he does have zero chance. I mean, Brian Kemp is polling so high, and even if people in urban areas and suburbs are being oversampled in these polls, making up in some cases, a nearly 32% point lead for Brian Kemp, in a runoff is going to be impossible, I think, for David Perdue to actually do. And with the primary on Tuesday and mail-in ballots already being shipped out and voters actually voting in this primary, I think it's very unlikely that David Perdue is able to even avoid a runoff election, and moreover a runoff. So I think David Perdue's chances are extremely, extremely slim to none as of right now. And, even early on in this race, David Perdue didn't really have much of a shot. His whole gubernatorial campaign was basically centered along the lines of Brian Kemp had failed to deliver the state of Georgia for Donald Trump. And that was basically the entire message. If you go look at the primary debates that Kemp and Perdue had, that was the main focus. His main attack line against Brian Kemp was that Brian Kemp has a pretty solid record as a Republican governor. Despite that, he passed concealed carry, the heartbeat bill, election integrity bill. So from a Republican standpoint, Brian Kemp has been a pretty solid governor. That's really his only blind spot with a segment of the base. And most people in the base are starting to overlook that. I mean, you have people voting for, the David Perdue share of the vote is dropped now to the 20s basically. And, at least earlier on, Perdue was consistently polling in the mid to high 30s. Now he's down to the 20s, and at a low point, he's at 22% in the second to latest poll that we've had. So really a bad showing for Perdue overall. Now, going back to the 2018 governor's race during a blue wave year, mind you, Brian Kemp was able to avoid a runoff against Stacey Abrams and won this race by 1.4%. Despite his abysmal showing in the formerly Republican stronghold areas of the Atlanta metro. Cobb County, he lost by 10. Gwinnett County, he lost by nearly 14. So on and so forth. So despite Brian Kemp's, and by the way, a lot of people said Brian Kemp was not electable during this election, even despite the fact that Georgia was still a red state at this point. It had voted for Donald Trump by 5 points in 2016. And even given the poor year for Republicans in governor's races, Brian Kemp was still able to keep Republicans in charge of the governor's mansion this time around, despite the fact that other states that voted to the right of Georgia, such as Kansas, had failed to do so. So it really goes to show you Brian Kemp does have electoral strength in the state. Stacey Abrams was a really strong candidate, had a strong grassroots campaign in the Atlanta metro area and other urban centers around the state, but it wasn't enough to offset the colossal margins that Brian Kemp got in northern Georgia and the rural parts of southern Georgia. And some of these counties he outperformed Trump's 2016 margins in. So that just demonstrates Brian Kemp's strength among the Georgia electorate, even in years that are not favorable to the Republican Party. Now, 2022 is expected to be a year favorable to Republicans. And if we take a look at the general election polls for this election, Brian Kemp beats Stacey Abrams in every single poll that has been conducted thus far. He leads her in the RCP aggregate by 5.2%. David Perdue, on the other hand, has one poll where he's tied with Stacey Abrams, and another poll where he's losing to her narrowly, and he leads her only by 3 points in the RCP aggregate, which is within the margin of error. Brian Kemp is outside the margin of error in his polls, so it's clear already that Brian Kemp is probably the stronger nominee to run for governor. He hasn't lost a statewide race in Georgia. David Perdue has. We can go back to the 2021 special elections in which David Perdue lost to Jon Ossoff by about 1.4%, the same margin that Brian Kemp actually won by in 2018. And he did worse in the suburbs than Brian Kemp did back in his 2018 run. And part of this was because the suburbs have shifted more to the left since 2018. Stacey Abrams and her voting rights groups have done a lot of work registering a lot of minority voters in the Atlanta area, in other parts of Georgia, to ultimately make the state a blue state. And it's been relatively successful thus far. Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock both won their respective special Senate elections. But back in 2020, David Perdue actually beat Jon Ossoff by a larger margin than Brian Kemp won his race back in 2018. He won by 1.8%, despite the fact that Georgia went to Joe Biden by 0.2. So he outperformed Donald Trump significantly in the state, and he did a lot better in the suburbs of Atlanta and some of these rural counties here. Now, despite the fact that David Perdue had won this election by over 80,000 votes, he failed to get 50%, which meant that the race had to go to a runoff election, which he ultimately lost, partly because of Democratic enthusiasm at the prospects of actually having control of the Senate 50-50 with Kamala Harris breaking the tie. And unfortunately for David Perdue, he wasn't able to overcome this enthusiasm. Also, in my opinion, he ran a pretty poor campaign. He dodged famously one of the debates with Jon Ossoff, although I believe that was before the 2020 election. But nonetheless, he ran a pretty lackluster campaign, to say the least. So did Kelly Loeffler. Both of the Republican nominees weren't exactly very strong, and they were constantly having to move further and further to the right to appeal to Donald Trump, fearing they'd have to deal with his wrath, similar to what Brian Kemp had to deal with from Donald Trump because of the election. And it's ironic because Brian Kemp actually did a lot of campaigning for David Perdue to make sure he actually won his Senate race. And ultimately it wasn't successful, but it goes to show you that the two men were actually really good friends before this primary election. And it's been a pretty messy primary, to say the least. Brian Kemp and David Perdue have been taking a lot of jabs at each other in the campaign. Hasn't really been exactly a civil campaign. And ultimately, it remains to be seen how much Republican support Brian Kemp will get in the general. I assume it's going to be quite a decent amount, considering that even though there's voters who are going to vote for Perdue in the primary that won't back Brian Kemp under any circumstances, I think he'll be able to overcome that hurdle with the kind of environment that we're expected to see in 2022. So Brian Kemp is definitely, in my opinion, the strongest Republican to run against Stacey Abrams. He is very, very, very likely to be the Republican to run against Stacey Abrams. He has a record as governor to run on in terms of boosting the economy in the state, the other conservative policies that have laid out to kind of bring the base out to vote for him. And ultimately, I think Perdue's shortcomings were mainly that, one, he was challenging a incumbent Republican governor that was still relatively popular. His popularity dipped after the election, but ultimately it sort of corrected course. Also, he's dealt with a massive fundraising disadvantage. He's raised money from Trump and some conservative groups, but most establishment Republican groups, the Republican Governors Association, back Brian Kemp. And, as a result, Brian Kemp has had a lot more money at his disposal. Although a lot of people have been saying, in the article that I read on from Insider that we pulled up earlier, did state that a lot of cash was being sat on by David Perdue. He's not really using it to run any ads or anything like that. So I wonder if he's already bracing for impact, given that his polls in the primary are so abysmally low. So as of right now, Brian Kemp is the presumptive Republican nominee for Georgia. He will be likely reelected to a next term based on the general election polling. Of course, we'll visit this race again before it occurs in November. But ultimately, Brian Kemp is the likely Republican nominee for the state of Georgia, as well as likely to be reelected to another term given the polling that we've seen so far. And, unless there's a major shift in the polls. But Stacey Abrams has never polled above 47%. And I think 2018 probably would have been her year to run, or perhaps she probably would have won if she had ran for the Senate seat as opposed to John Ossoff. She'd probably be a senator right now. So I think she really blew her opportunity there. But ultimately, Brian Kemp will likely win this primary. I think he's going to avoid a runoff. And that'll be my final prediction on the race. I'll release a more specific prediction on Monday before the primary elections with the actual margins I think we're expected to see. But Brian Kemp is the favorite to win the Republican nominee by a large amount. So anyway, guys, thank you all for watching this video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.